I just want to spend a minute talking about Richard's credentials so you know that he's worthy of our time this evening. Richard North Patterson is prolific and widely read. Eden in Winter is his 22nd novel and the third and final book in his Martha's Vineyard trilogy, which is a family drama set here on in our lovely Up Island Mist. At least 16 of his novels have been New York Times bestsellers, and worldwide sales of his books are over 25 million. He's a 1971 graduate of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, good Midwestern boy, and a recipient of that university's President's Award for Distinguished Alumni and its President's Award for Excellence. He was an assistant attorney general for the state of Ohio, a trial attorney for the SEC in Washington, and he was the SEC's liaison to the Watergate special prosecutor. He was also a partner in the San Francisco office of Bingham and McCutcheon before retiring from practice in 1993. He did what many of us only dream of doing, which is in 1993, he retired from law practice and became a full-time writer. He'd already published widely at that point, but he gave it all up to dedicate his career very successfully to writing. The year he retired from law, Degree of Guilt came out, followed by Eyes of a Child in 1995. Both of them became international bestsellers, and both were combined into a mini-series for NBC. The Final Judgment came out in 95, Silent Witness in 97, No Safe Place in 98, and Dark Lady in 99. All became immediate international bestsellers, and in 2011, Silent Witness became a feature film on TNT. Protect and Defend in 2000 was about the controversial nomination of the first woman to the Chief Justice position, and it was a #1 New York Times bestseller and received a Maggie Award from Planned Parenthood. In 2013, the London Guardian Literary Review named No Safe Place one of the 10 best works inspired by John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination in the 50 years since his death. He's dealt with the issue of gun violence and balance of power in 2003. Conviction, focused on the law and politics of capital punishment. Exile in 2007, dealt with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and was nominated for South Africa's leading literary award. The Race in 2007 concerned a dramatic campaign for president, and Eclipse in 2009 dealt with human rights issues in Africa. So I could go on because there were so many books, and then the trilogy came out about Martha's Vineyard, and the one that Rick is discussing tonight is the third in that series. In 2012, Mr. Patterson received the Silver Bullet Award from the International Thriller Writers Association for his contributions to the wider community. He lives in West Tisbury and various other places, and he seems, as you may see in some of his work, that he's not so partial to Chilmark, but yet sometimes he comes over to Chilmark. So we're delighted that he's here tonight. And another West Tisbury resident is here with us to interview Rick. Off of his sickbed from the great Macaroni Gate, Tony Horwitz is here to interview Rick Patterson. Tony's a native of Washington, D.C., a graduate of Brown and Columbia's University School of Journalism. He worked for many years as a newspaper reporter, first in Indiana, and then during a decade overseas in Australia, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, mainly covering wars and conflict as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting and wrote for The New Yorker before becoming a full-time author. His books include the national and New York Times bestsellers Confederates in the Attic, Blue Latitudes, Baghdad Without a Map, and A Voyage Long and Strange. Midnight Rising was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2011. Tony's also been a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University and a visiting scholar at the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. He and Geraldine live in with their 2 sons in West Tisbury. So we're delighted to have 2 West Tisbury residents here in Chilmark. Thank you, sir. The format will be that Tony is interviewing Rick. It's being videotaped, so they will take questions from the audience. I just will ask that one of you repeat the question so we can make sure that everything gets on video. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sue Ellen. Am I on here? Can you hear me?
Okay, let me.
Is that better? Closer to the mic? How is that? There we go. Now you got me. All right. First, housekeeping.
Okay.
I heard from Dawn at Bunch of Grapes. There was another author on the island yesterday who moved about 1,000 units. So I know Rick will be very disappointed if we don't do the same tonight.
Devastated. You don't want to see it.
You know, buy those books. I'm thrilled and honored to be here tonight to interview Rick Patterson. And since he claims he's written his last work, I think of tonight as his exit interview upon leaving the book business. So I want to know why he's quit and you know, what those of us who are still in the book trade can do to keep great employees like him. But first I want to talk about his latest, Eden in Winter, and allegedly his last. For those of you who haven't read it, it's a real page-turner, a taut psychological thriller that's mostly set here in Martha's Vineyard. There's murder, sodomy, a CIA killer, a Hollywood siren, all these things I associate with our island. So Rick has really opened my eyes, at least to his wonderfully lively imagination. So seriously, though, one of the great joys of reading this book is your fictional adaptation of what, to all of us in this room at least, are familiar places. One character describes the Chilmark social scene as high school for the rich and vapid. And
I
most
said that.
of the dark, I forgot which character that is, yeah. But most of the dark stuff in the book happens here too. So I guess one question I have is why you chose to pick on Chilmark instead of, say, West Shop, and more generally, what was it like to write about a place so familiar to you as opposed to the Middle East and Nigeria and other exotic places you've written about?
Well, I was just tired of picking on gun nuts and Nigerians and Middle Easterners. So I've loved this place for years. It's a very distinctive place. It's a beautiful place. It has a fascinating mix of people. We have the winter population, the summer population, and their existences are quite different, and they often don't cross. And so I enjoyed the business of writing a book which is sort of across summer versus permanent residence, class, conflict, and the like. And you know, like any place where one goes to write a novel, one observes certain things. I mean, there's great beauty in this island. There's a wonderful winter community who are still very dependent on each other. This is one of those rare places where there's still a kind of almost Eisenhower years feelings where people don't lock their house, and all that's very unique. And there are, at the same time, some of the most brilliant people who come here. Family is obviously a great influence on us all, for good, bad, and indifferent. And an island like this, as close as this can be in the wintertime, makes family all that more a tense experience. So this book, like many of my books, is about, or these books, is about parents and children, men and women, people and what they want, and how the strengths and weaknesses of family translate through the generations, both in terms of what is done, perhaps what is not said and revealed. So that was all fun for me. As to the casual remarks I made about Chilmark, I must say that it is fascinating to be in a summer community. I've never lived in a summer community before. And there is both a marvelous collection of some of the most fascinating people, some of my best friends, and I must say the highest quotient of social anxiety I have seen anywhere. It's really quite remarkable. I happened to be at the party last night where the presidents were present, and I gathered that there are a number of people called up the host and hostess and said, surely you must not have known I was in town, because otherwise you would have asked me. I was reminded of the terrible thing a very waspy mother of a very waspy friend once said to a woman who showed up unannounced at his 16th birthday party, "Oh, Jennifer, how nice to see you. If we'd known you were coming, we would have invited you."
So wait, you're saying there were people trying to sort of gate crash last night?
Oh, funny. Well, you know, yes, in a word. What else to say? So there's, and with that comes a high degree of malice and gossip, and which I have duly recorded in my books, I think not unfairly. But it all goes with this territory, and it's all part of what makes this sort of distinctive and interesting place to be. And plus, it's just one of the most beautiful places on earth. And there's nothing better than the opportunity to describe something as striking and unique as this island.
Well, I mean, there are many delicious moments of recognition for anybody who knows and loves this island, beautiful places, restaurants, etc. But I was a little surprised to find an actual islander I know in the book, Dr. Jason Liu, a lovely gynecologist. Except in your book, he's not a kindly doctor. He's a chain-smoking crook who can break and enter into any building. I don't see Jason here tonight, but did he pay for this privilege? Oh, he is here. Did you pay for this at some charity auction on the island?
And
were you consulted?
Worse, I did it without telling him, which was really a great part of the fun. But the truth is, I golf with Jason, and anyone who golfs with me, as Jason does regularly, has to be one of the most tolerant people on God's earth. So I figured that Jason, being the most benign person in the world, that I could get away with it. A quick Jason story. We were out golfing a couple of years ago, and this guy who's a hedge fund guy who we didn't know gets matched up with us. On the first hole, he shows us all his holdings, how rich he was. Second hole, he showed us on his iPad how much money he made that day. Third hole, he told us all about all the rich clients he had. And this went on for 9 holes. I mean, Jason and I could have been serial killers. He'd ask us not a single question about us. At the end, he peels off. And I said to Jason, who's a kinder person I am, I said, you know, Jason, even by the standards of the vineyard, that's the biggest jerk I've met this summer. And to which Jason said, as a Buddhist, he makes me sad. So
So you've reincarnated him as a
I figured I could get away with murder with Jason, and damn near did. Thank you, pal.
All right. He's still smiling, so no libel suit. At a book event the other day, Ward just said he does almost no research for his novels. He relies almost entirely on his imagination and what he already knows. Obviously, you have a different approach. Can you talk about aspects of this book that required research so that you could be as true as possible to what you were describing?
Well, I think the biggest thing probably, and you know, I'm sure some novelist has done it. I've never seen it. There are several scenes of very intense psychotherapy in the book, and that's rooted in the psychology, really, of several of the characters. One particular person is going through the therapy, but his concerns also involve his father, his mother, his potential lover, and others, not to mention his rather dangerous occupation. And so I spent hours and hours with my beloved friend, the late Dr. Bill Glazer, and with my dear friend Charlie Silverstein, both practicing therapists, really sort of going through not only how the therapy would go, but really the psychology of all these people. Like, okay, if they were like this, why might that be? Or if this happened to them, how might it affect their reactions? In particular, intense interest to me was the relationship between Adam and Karla Pucelli, who's sort of the female protagonist. And it's a very, very complicated adult love affair, shot full with very serious issues, because she was involved with his, shall we say, quasi-father, somebody he thought was his father, for a long time, which has, at the very least, some Freudian, if not Oedipal overtones.
It's a therapist's dream.
But it was fascinating to do and fun to do, and to try to find the emotional logic in a relationship that is as fraught and complicated as this one was one of the fascinating challenges of the book. So I spent, that was hours. The other thing, Karla is, those who have read the book will know, as an actress. She had a rather successful career before burning out from substance abuse, and I really wanted to get a sense of her internally, what the acting career might have been like, what her experience might have been like, but it's also the whys of it. So again, for hours, I interviewed Marcia Gay Harden, who some of you may know, a wonderful actress, Tony winner, Oscar winner, and if she wins an Emmy, she'll get the Triple Crown, and she was wonderful, and so I learned a lot from her too. So Ward is a man of incredible talent, wonderful imagination. I'm not sure I could have dreamed up the therapy scenes or this actress as well without this help. And for me, interviewing is, I think writing is kind of like method acting. If you go into a world that is dissimilar from that which you've occupied in your normal life, then you better occupy it with some conviction. And really getting to know a lot about the subject matter that I'm writing about, and a lot about the people in it, is a way of feeling rooted so I can give the reader a better experience.
Well, your books are not just deeply researched, they're often very timely. In an earlier book, and I can't remember which of the 22 it was, there's a plot involving capturing Osama bin Laden. And in this book, you have a subplot involving a rescue mission for Bo Bergdahl, the American soldier.
And it's a complete shot in the dark, because the book was finished a year and a half ago.
Yeah, and I was thinking, wow, that's kind of interesting. So can you talk about sort of the appeal, but also perhaps the risks of trying to be on the news in your fiction?
Well, I'll tell you about the risks, and the risks are exacerbated if you write a current book, which your publisher then waits 15 months to publish. So I'll tell a story about The Devil's Light, which was about the threat of transnational terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction by non-state actors. And again, I did a lot of research. I traveled extensively. I hung around the CIA a lot, and learned everything I could. The one problem I had in writing about Al-Qaeda was this. I mean, we knew that bin Laden was out there somewhere. We assumed he was alive. Lots of people assumed he was in the remote mountains of Pakistan, but nobody knew for sure. So I finessed it by having him alive at 2009 when we knew he was, and just having his existence obscure thereafter. So I thought that was fine. I'm booked to go on a bunch of national TV shows. I fly back to New York on Sunday, and I turn on the news just to amuse myself, and there's Wolf Blitzer looking more than usually grave, and he says, "We have important national security announcement." I thought, oh crap, they killed the son of a bitch, because the one thing that I couldn't have was anticipate in my book, oh yeah, he was killed in a suburb of Islamabad, and so the whole thing was messed up. I was throwing off every show in favor of Navy SEALs, admirals, folks like that. It was just
couldn't have held off on
a complete trailer. And I really thought if they could only put the guy in the fridge for about for a couple of weeks at least. But the funny code of all this is about 3 weeks later, I'm in Washington, and a spokesman of the CIA calls me up and says, you and your wife want to come over for dinner? We'll have some interesting people. I say, sure. So we go over there, and the place is ringing with security, and I think, okay, all right. So I go in, and sure enough, it's Leon Panetta, director of the CIA. He says, I really want you to know how sorry we were about screwing up your book, We really thought about it. I personally felt quite bad, but we thought we just had to go ahead and kill him. I said, thanks, Leon. I just feel a whole load better.
All right, well, let's move on to your so-called retirement from writing. the first question is this for real, or is this going to be a Michael Jordan retirement, and we will be back here next year, you announcing you're back for another season, and we'll have to farewell you again?
I like to think of myself as a Michael Jordan of writing, but my vertical leap is really not that good. No, I've thought about this for several years, intensely for the last couple. I should tell you in a way, the last two books I wrote, which I'm very proud of and which I hope all of you will buy and enjoy and all of that, were a kind of a form of assisted suicide because I knew that they were not going to be career moves for me. I should back up and explain why that's so. There's almost nothing bad about being a best-selling author. But one of the difficulties that comes with it is the expectation of publishers that you will do that which you did before because you sold books before, and why not do more of it? The problem with that is that aside from the fact that that level of repetition would drive me crazy and make me very cynical about my work, I had lots and lots of things that I wanted to write about. So when I wrote courtroom dramas and then started writing political novels, there was resistance from publishers. Why are you doing that? When I wrote geopolitical novels, why are you writing about Israel and Palestine? When I wrote about things like abortion or gun control, they said, oh my God, why are you doing that? It was like I put Rosemary's Baby on their desk. I mean, they really, really hated it. It's been a battle for me throughout to push the envelope and do what I did, still sell books, try to maintain an audience, keep them happy, keep them paying me. As I often said, alimony and tuition were a great inspiration to my art, so that always was on my mind. So that was wearisome, I've got to say. The other thing is the business is changing. I mean, Kindles are cannibalizing hardback sales. That is not profitable for authors. The review media that you and I and Geraldine and others have enjoyed for years are dwindling. There's less review media than there used to be, which means that there are less good ways of having people bring attention to your book. 2008 really put a big hit in the book business. So when I got to writing Loss of Innocence particularly, it's a coming-of-age novel about a young woman, 21-year-old woman in 1968. The reaction of most publishers is, why in the world are you doing that? And who says you can't? Well, I proceeded to write a book, which I think is quite a good book, and indeed nobody told me that it wasn't. But it was like, I don't know how we market you like this. I don't know how we sell you like this. This completely confounds the expectations of our audience. We don't know what to do. Can't you sort of put it in a drawer and write something we like better? One publisher suggested I might come by his office so he could give me a few ideas. You can imagine how well I reacted to that. And so I said, no, I'm going to write these books. I'm going to publish these books. The coming-of-age novel is very sort of complicated, psychologically based family drama and romance. And I knew that by doing that, I was really going off the reservation. So I made a decision that I'd write the books, I'd have them published, and because I wanted to do work I was proud of, and that I wouldn't concern myself with writing further. And what I found was that I can go on. I mean, I certainly could go on and write and be published, and it would be fine. I can still write a novel, I'm quite sure. But I also think there's such a thing as knowing when to leave. I mean, I'm not Michael Jordan, I'm not Ted Williams either, but Ted Williams, during his last season, he's still playing very good ball, went up in September in Boston, hit a long home run, ran around the bases, disappeared, and was never seen again. And I thought, how elegant, how perfect. I do think there's a certain grace in knowing when to leave before one is asked. And I also found that I was really satisfied with what I'd done. I had written all kinds of books. I hadn't left anything undone, I thought. So I really had a feeling sort of completion of all of that. And also just a remarkable feeling of good fortune. If you do well in a business as hard as this, you're aware of your profound good luck. And I had good luck for over 2 decades, and it's been remarkable to me. And I'm sort of happy to say, well, that was nice.
I did hear a line in there, I can still write a novel and get published. I can hear that a year from now, sort of the comeback line. But anyway.
No, I'm painting badly.
We will take you at your word. From what I was hearing, it sounds like you felt boxed in or pigeonholed. We've had some frank conversations about the economics of book writing, and without getting into the exact numbers, for those maybe who aren't aware of what's just actually happening to storytellers in terms of pay and sales.
Oh, it's cratered. I mean, there's been a precipitous drop in sales, a precipitous drop in compensation. It's all true. I mean, I think generally about my generation of people, the boomers, that we're the luckiest people on the planet because we were born at the cusp of the American century when we were predominant in the world. We had great manufacturing, we had all these natural resources, we had only one real center of power to worry about. We were pretty safe sitting over here. And in many ways, we were good. And when I became a best-selling author, it was kind of the cusp of the writing business, the early 90s. And I mean, I just feel like I landed in a sweet spot. One of the small ironies of this business now, and you and I have talked about this, is our dear friends at Amazon. Amazon used novels as a cat's paw to get in the business of mass marketing everything on earth, and having maneuvered us so they could sell everything on earth. They've now set about screwing us in a variety of ways, and one of them is that Hachette, which happens to be the parent company of my publisher, is in a dispute with Amazon. Amazon wants various price concessions. And so they stopped accepting pre-orders for books, including mine. I'm not going to suffer because of it, but other people will, and readers will, and writers will. I think it's contemptible. I think it's of a piece with the increasing entitlement of more and more institutions to exercise whatever power they can. When we feel sorry for rich people in this country and we think that a higher marginal tax rate is class warfare, we really have lost perspective, I would say, on a few things. But in any event, I digress. The point is that the business is harder. That certainly doesn't enhance my desire to do any of this. I mean, it was really so pleasant before.
Right. Now, on the positive note, you're leaving writing in part to devote more time to your painting. And David McCulloch said something interesting the other day about how when he was in college, he was a history major, but that he took as many art classes as he could because it really teaches you how to see the world, and that proved very useful in his writing. Is painting in any sense, I don't know, a displacement activity or in any way connected to your writing? And when will we be seeing your nude self-portrait?
Never. Yeah, sorry, guys. It displaces it in a certain way. It's very different. When I was a kid, everybody told me I should write. There's not a single person I can recall told me why, the world was a bunch of paintings. So this really is an act of nerve as much as anything. And I'm not eager to thrust them on the world at this point. But it is a very different, in particular, a very nice way of looking at the world. I mean, you observe a tree and you see the different shapes. You try to figure out how to render distances. You see the green is not just green, it's a host of other things. And on and on and on. I find myself stopping to look at things in a different way. It's sort of like riding a bike or walking as opposed to driving past something. And it's actually a very nice pursuit in that way. And my hope is to get as good as I can. I don't know how good that is, but I've got the rest of my life to do it. So, and it does, like writing, It's an individual pursuit. This thing, however good or bad it is, would not exist without you. You're not really accountable to anyone, as writers generally are, other than editors, whose intentions certainly are good. The time just goes. So there's a lot of good reasons for me to be doing this now, other than talent, and that's dubious, but well.
Characters in your latest book describe winter here as so bad that it's torture for depressives, and less Eden in winter than a Grimm's fairy tale. I live here year-round, and am I to take from those comments that you won't be joining us now that you've retired from book writing?
Well, I've noticed the facial tics that you've been coming up with lately. I'm actually deeply concerned. But, I am an absolute seasonal affective disorder person, so my reaction is typical. Nancy, my wife, lived here for years in a cabin in the woods in the dead of winter and just was in heaven. Me, not so much. When it gets to be dark about 4 o'clock, I become a deeply troubled human being. I'm beginning to feel like Jack Nicholson in The Shining. And so, no, it's unlikely. I'm afraid of two things in the world more than anything: death and snow. So I'm hoping to postpone the first and avoid the second entirely.
Death and Snow. That's a good title. I could ask on and on, but why don't we open it up for the audience? I've been asking softball questions here, so chime in with a tough one.
Yeah, no, really be brutal.
Again, this is his exit interview. He's going to say anything that comes to his mind. He's
I don't care.
Not going to be guarded here. So if you have any tough questions, hammer away. Anybody?
Well, Tony, you're going to have to ask more softball questions.
Here we go.
I apologize because I can't remember the title of the book, but the one that is about gun reform.
Mm-hmm.
I found that really fascinating, and I found it eerily close to what the situation is now with Obama and I believe it was a black president who kind of said your main character in the book as a president.
Just to repeat the question for anyone can hear it, it was, which book is it?
It's Balance of Power, which was published in 2002, so we're talking 12 years from now.
The question was about the issue of gun control and how it resonates now. And
Before your time.
right, you were ahead of the curve.
Well, the really terrible thing is that nothing has changed in 12 years except that it's gotten worse. I think that I've written about the abortion debate, just for the sake of comparison. And one can have different views about abortion and reproductive rights, but the abortion debate at its highest level has a moral dignity. There are genuine ethical questions that you can debate back and forth about conception, meaning of life, and I know where I came out ultimately. But I always understood that this was an argument that had some real substance. By contrast, the gun debate, in my view, is the single most contemptible, intellectually vulgar political debate I can think of, at least domestically, in that it's based on fear. It is almost uniformly dishonest. It takes a slippery slope, fear-mongering to sort of new heights. What is it that says that the legitimate rights of hunters or people to have a gun for self-defense if they feel that that's what they want? How is that threatened by banning semi-automatic weapons are so inaccurate that their only possible purpose is to kill a lot of people in a room this size very quickly, or 50-clip magazines, or rules that have background checks for people who are felons or convicted of domestic violence or another violent crime or adjudicated mentally ill or substance abusers. I mean, we'd all be safer. But if you mention any of those things, the National Rifle Association will tell you, well, the next thing you know, they're going to come and take your gun. And you read their magazine, it's full of two things: fear and nonsense, and a lot of apocrypha on how lots of people are out there defending themselves with weapons. I might add that some of these fantasies have a distinctly unpleasant racial tinge, which certainly was evidenced during the Trayvon Martin thing. So sadly, I mean, I write these books in the hope of influencing the debate in some way. And I do know that I've made an impression on some folks, and I certainly appreciate your comments. But it's very disheartening that so many of the things I wrote about seem to have only gotten worse. And maybe if I wrote a book about, you know, a nuclear apocalypse, there'd be world peace. It's the only thing I can think of. But that one is particularly disheartening to me. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question to that. There's a cliche in Hollywood that if you want to make a political point, get a billboard. Don't make a film.
Yeah.
One might add,
Yeah.
write a novel.
Yeah.
You've managed remarkably to create art while having a billboard, a much more sophisticated billboard, but you clearly have political points of view that are central to
Right.
this one genre of your writing. How have you managed to defy that caveat of not trying to combine art with politics?
Well, I certainly was always very conscious that, you know, that my first obligation was to entertain and engage the reader, because if you don't do that, all else is lost. So I was always very concerned with story, with character, with setting, with creating people that you cared about, with situations that you hope would be resolved in some way or another, all the things that make people turn the pages of any reasonable good fiction. I was always, by the way, terribly concerned with knowing how the novel ended for two reasons. One, the coherence of events, but also the psychological consistency of characters. And if you look at some novels, and I'll pick on Tom Wolfe because he's perfectly secure, if you look at Bonfire of the Vanities, it's a wonderful novel through 80% through, then it absolutely falls off the cliff. It's true with every one of his books. They become cliff notes at the end. So, and I was not surprised to learn that he never knew how his books were going to end. So anyhow, I concerned myself with all the things that would make good fiction. And then I tried to figure out how best I could to impart in dramatic terms the issues I was writing about. In Conviction, for example, it was an 11th hour death penalty appeal. And as you know, the law on those habeas corpus petitions is very adverse. There's a lot of inherent suspense in that. And part of the suspense was learning how hard it is to vindicate even a man where there's real evidence of innocence, and how at some point the question of actual innocence becomes irrelevant to the litigation of a death penalty case. So there's a lot of suspense in that. And I didn't have to work very hard to convey that. In terms of the Israeli-Palestinian book, for example, which was, I think, my most fascinating experience, I made a real effort to present this in a way that was dramatic. It culminated in trial, but also was fair and interesting to both sides, where people were always learning something about the situation and perhaps they didn't know. So I just tried to infuse the normal engines of readable fiction with these issues in a way that enhanced the enjoyment of the reader rather than detracted from. I didn't have people leaving long speeches, you know, as you know, and then talking for 4 days about reproductive rights or something. So it seemed to have worked. I mean, my #1 bestseller, Protect and Defend, was a book my publisher absolutely did not want to see because it involved late-term abortion and parental consent laws. I mean, two things that people are really edgy about. But it worked, and I was very happy to have made the effort.
Sue Ellen?
Several of the authors in the series have talked about the process.
I'll repeat it.
Several of them have talked about their process in writing, and that they just start out with an idea and let it evolve. You seem to much part of the process.
Just to repeat the question for those who couldn't hear, she was saying that several of the writers in this series have talked about process and how they have an idea that they launch into and sort of see where it goes, and that Rick's approach seems to be different, quite outlined, or he knows where it's going, or is that the case?
Yeah, no, I'm the world's most linear human being. I'm a typical sad product of American legal education. You know, seriously, the law did me actually a lot of good. But one thing I learned that I really had to do, and it became more elaborate, is I was taking on information that was not native to me, things I really didn't know about. Human rights in oil, Nigeria would be a pretty good example of that. I had to do something to properly control, deploy all the information I learned in a way that, as I was saying to Alan, would be readable. So the process went something like this. I would think about the general idea until I had a story I wanted to tell, knowing full well that there are lots of things I needed to know to make the story work. I would then do all the research for Exile. I perhaps interviewed 100 people or so. And I would do memos for each subject area. Then I would outline the book really with a folder for every scene and the research memos in that folder relevant to that scene. So I would divide a book into maybe 80 folders and 4 sections, and every day there'd be a folder on my desk to work with. I might write well or badly, but I was never confused about where I was or trying to remember what did so-and-so tell me about this thing or that thing. And I think when you do, and maybe it's akin to writing nonfiction, and I don't know how you do it, but there was a lot of factual information that had to be deployed in those books. So that was the way I did it. It's just a story about one of the fun things when I was doing Protect and Defend, the book about the abortion at the Supreme Court and presidential level. I went to interview Bob Dole. He'd just run for president. He'd late been majority leader of the Senate, and I did with him, as I do with all interviewers, I send an outline of the plot so they know the context, and I send a list of questions which I wanted to address in general so that they can think about it. And I asked him, essentially, the plot concerned the first woman to be nominated to be Chief Justice, and she gets embroiled in a horrible, bitter fight over an abortion case that threatens her confirmation. I said to him, in essence, Senator Dole, if you were still Republican Majority Leader and you wanted to take this nominee down by any means at hand, how would you do it? And he told me, and it was brilliant. And among the things he said, and this only became a tactic later, is I think about filibustering her. I think about using a 60-vote threshold in the Senate to keep her from being nominated. Nobody'd ever done that. This is like the late 90s. Now it's a common and kind of deplorable tactic for dealing with judicial nominees. But anyway, Dole's wonderful. He's a funny guy and a brilliant guy tactically, and that was great. So I'm back in my office, or back in my hotel room next day, and I'm dictating my notes, or no, later that afternoon, and phone rings, and it's voice says, "Is the White House, the president will see you tonight. Do you have time to see the president?" I said, "Yes, I imagine I could make time for that." And so I went over and I asked President Clinton the same basic thing. How would you salvage this nomination? And he was terrific. He brought out the Ruth Bader Ginsburg file. We were talking about that. Pretty soon we're trading votes for seats on commissions, and we're designing ads, and we're doing all this stuff. And it was great. I mean, he's an absolute genius. And I walked out of the White House. I thought, I've got the coolest job in the world. And one of the privileges of doing research is that people would put up with me because I was writing a book. I mean, you've had this experience. And, you just learn a ton about things you'd otherwise never know from people who are being gracious in ways that just astound you. So it was wonderful. A last story about this, because it's such a great one, and he was such a lovely friend. And 9/10/2010, I flew back. I was working on the gun control book. I flew back to talk to Ted Kennedy about it in D.C., and we talked for a couple of hours. He was wonderful. He had all sorts of good things to say. He had some people doing research for me. It was terrifically helpful and informative. And at the end of it, he said, everyone knows how I feel about guns, which is, poignant, really. He said, but you really should talk to John Edwards, because he knows he has to deal with this in a different part of the country than I do. And it would be useful to talk to him. I said, well, I thought about it. If I don't know Edwards, I don't know his people. And Ted said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. So I'm in my hotel room the next morning, again dictating notes. I've got the TV on the background. Plane hits the World Trade Center. Second plane hits the World Trade Center. I'm of course sick, like everyone was, because you know what's happening. But it also struck me that if the United States Senate was ever concerned with my make-believe, they certainly weren't now. And that was Tuesday, but I couldn't get out of Dodge because they weren't letting planes fly out of D.C., so I was just stuck there. So that's Tuesday morning. Thursday morning, phone rings. Rick, it's John Edwards. Teddy says you're a friend of his and you want to talk to me, and I try to do anything that Teddy tells me to do. And Edwards gave me a ton of information in the middle of this terrible, terrible thing. And I was struck by the fact that Ted actually remembered that he'd made this promise, even with all of that. I ended up getting more out of that trip than I would have imagined. So,
There was someone earlier, I think right here, had a question. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, ask and you shall receive. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean,
Not how easy it is, but how people do want to talk.
Yeah.
If you can just get to them and ask a question.
Well, you've had a number of amazing experiences.
Well, yeah, I mean, one was, very different, but Uday Hussein, Saddam Hussein's son, and I had heard he was going to be at a nightclub, and went there in Baghdad, and indeed he was there. The problem was I was so shocked I couldn't think really what to ask him. I mean, sort of, why are you a war criminal?
Yeah.
But I did go up with another reporter, and I mean, he chatted. He didn't give us a lot, but if Uday Hussein, is murderous son of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, and you're still alive. That's a bonus.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll just, a last question then, maybe is there someone else out there? Yeah, well, then why don't you have the last one then?
You talked about the relationship with publishers and the tensions there, and the experience that you've had with people you've interviewed and the voice there. I'm curious about what it's like to be edited and the relationships with the editors, and in particular, as an artist, no one is editing your work.
Actually, it was almost uniformly terrific. I had one experience, which I'll mention at the end of this, but Tony and I, for years, shared an editor in common, a fellow named John Sterling at Holt. And John was terrific. And it was not a 5-minute process. Yeah. John would go over the book line by line, and make suggestions about language. And I was not heavily edited because I self-editor. I mean, I always believe that writing is rewriting. In any sentence in a book, I've been over several times by the time it gets to the editor. Nonetheless, John had good suggestions, and we would take a day. I'd fly back to New York. We'd flip through the pages, and we'd do all that. And then would there be a second pass where he would look at the book more on a macro, how is the narrative flowing? Do we need this? How is this scene really working? And he said he really couldn't do both at once because one was very sort of minute and microscopic and the other was more cosmic. But I didn't resent it at all because, I wasn't turning in, bad books in the first place, but I would say that the books were probably 10% better by the time John and I got through with them, and 10% was important. I very seldom quarreled with him, and if I did, I had a reason for it, and he got it, and we moved on. That said, my one terrible experience was turning in the book Conviction, and having the publisher be appalled that this was this dark book about the death penalty and complicated book about the Supreme Court. And she thought the book would really be good if it had a stalker in there, preferably a pedophile. I wasn't quite so excited about that prospect. And at one point, she sent me a letter suggesting that I have the female lawyer in this go into jail and, quote, confront this stalker like a mother bear defending her cub. Now, that was a very high, lofty literary suggestion. And it was spoiled for me only by the fact that there's no way in hell anybody let her in the president to threaten this guy in the first place. You know, it's like, I'm sorry, I can't watch the TV show Scandal, where Kerry Washington walks into the Oval Office all the time, just chews people. It's absurd. I said no. And then she said, why? I said, because that's the worst editorial suggestion I've ever received in my entire career. That was not a happy conversation. And the relationship sort of went south after that. But with that exception, I know there's a lot of suggestion that editing is dead in New York. That certainly was not my experience, and happily so.
And knowing John Sterling, I would also just say, though, it wasn't unusual. He is an unusually attentive editor.
Yeah.
And one of the things, at least that I worry about with all the cutbacks in publishing is, I read books now where I sometimes think, where was the editor? I think writers are suffering, but editors are too. And I think readers will or already are as well because of that. So I don't think our experience is necessarily typical. Right. Okay, one more, and then we'll, I think, wrap it up.
I was curious about, especially the next Palestinian-Israeli story, which was incredible, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If with any of your stories, even though you're leaning towards the painting now, if you felt an urge or compulsion to do a follow-up story, or did you ever feel like the character was still calling to you and it was unfinished?
Yeah, actually, it's funny you should say that, because Exile was a book that did leave me with that feeling for a while. I never tried to nail down how to write a follow-on book. And regrettably, the depressing realities of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict have only grown more depressing in the 7 years since that book was published. And in particular, this sort of grim cycle where, I mean, Nancy and I spent a lot of time on the West Bank, and we spent a lot of time in Israel. And one cannot come away without a sense of the tremendous tragedy that this involves for all sorts of people. I interviewed Palestinians who had lost family. I interviewed people who had lost their entire family to suicide bombing performed by Palestinians. And the one thing that I keep coming back to is how the extremes always manage to rule the day. I mean, we now have Hamas doing what Hamas has done. And I certainly do not quarrel with Israel's right to defend itself, deal with the tunnels, or any of that. But one backs up a moment, one can see all the times when this situation might not have been so. And one can see all the peace negotiations which failed, I think, quite frankly, because people on both sides have neither had the courage or, quite by design, have chosen to fabricate issues in ways that prevent peace. In 96, I think it was in 96, after the death of Rabin, Hamas sent a wave of suicide bombers into Israel, the result being that Shimon Peres, who was prime minister, was unseated by Netanyahu. Well, you don't have to be a keen analyst to know that Peres and Netanyahu have fundamentally different views of the peace process, and even more so as recent Israeli politics have evolved. And to me, it's just melancholy. It's a terribly complicated thing, and we all have different feelings about it. It's melancholy to see people like people in West Bank, good leaders like Syed Fayed, who was formerly the Prime Minister of the PLO, just sort of overrun, or the West Bank, just sort of overrun by this terrible extremism, and I don't see any immediate hope that it will end. I'd like to think it will, but in any event, when I look at the situation that's evolved, I could never see a way into it that wasn't more of same, and that was just not a book I ended up wanting to spend time with anymore. So,
I hate to end on that down a note. What's hopeful? I mean, I wish we had a gold pen or something to offer you. I don't know what you do at the end of a writing. Has anyone? I mean, Philip Roth did retire recently, didn't? I mean, this is not.
yeah, he's
common.
a copycat as far as
Yeah.
I'm concerned.
I for one kind of hope you are Michael Jordan and come back next season, but otherwise we'll be going to your painting.
Well, this is it for me. This event is literally it for me. So, I just want to say how grateful I am for the years I've had, how grateful I am to all of these who've chosen to read me when there's other things they could have done with their time and their money. Saw Bill Clinton last night at that party. He said, I paid good money for that book of yours today. I said, geez, Mr. President, I've known you were going to be here, I would have bought you a free copy. But for all of you who have not bought free copies and have recommended me to your friends and have chosen to come here tonight and listen, it's just been a privilege. And thank you so very much.
Thank you.